We remember the 1970s public information films for their terror. But why did the British government feel it had to traumatize an entire generation of its own children? The answer isn't just a weird artistic choice. It reveals a desperate clash between an old-fashioned, free-range childhood and the sudden, invisible dangers of a newly modernized Britain. The perilous playground. The 1970s are often viewed through a nostalgic lens, but contemporary accounts describe it as a uniquely hazardous peacetime era. This was a wild time defined by economic downturn, widespread industrial strikes, and IRA bombings. Dangers felt present in everyday life, from leaded petrol and dense smog to asbestos in buildings and football hooliganism. This pervasive anxiety was the backdrop for a new crisis, a perceived rise in accidental child deaths. The central conflict was simple. Children's lives were different then. With no computer games and only 3 TV channels, the default state for childhood was to be outdoors, completely unsupervised. Entertainment consisted of going on adventures and finding excitement in odd places. This was enabled by what was described as questionable parenting by today's standards. For centuries, this free-range culture was normal, but these odd places were now the frontiers of a rapidly modernizing Britain. Post-war reconstruction was still going on, meaning children's playgrounds were often the perils of building sites and rubbish dumps. The government's response to this clash was a media campaign that sociologists would recognize as a classic moral panic. This concept, developed by Stanley Cohen specifically to describe 1970s Britain, models how a condition is perceived and defined as a threat to societal values, in this case, child safety. This threat is then amplified by the mass media, the PIFS, using simplistic, symbolic rhetoric, like a Grim Reaper figure. This, in turn, arouses a sense of social anxiety and concern among the public. The PIFS did not just reflect the era's anxieties, they actively constructed and broadcast them directly into the home. The farm as a factory, Apaches. The canonical example of this collision between a free-range childhood and a modernized landscape is the 1977 film Apaches, commissioned by the Central Office of Information and produced by Graphic Films. It was directed by John Mackenzie, who would soon after direct the British gangster classic The Long Good Friday. Apaches was a 27-minute documentary that was shown in schools all over Britain. It follows a group of 6 children playing cowboys and Indians on a seemingly idyllic farm. The film then watches as they are picked off one by deadly farming machinery. It served as a veritable faces of death of fatal farmyard hazards. The horror came from the mundane specificity of the deaths, which amplified their horror. One child is crushed by a reversing tractor. Another drinks poisonous liquid, chemical pesticide, left unattended in a bottle. A third suffocates after falling into a grain pit. A final victim is burned in a rick fire. But the death that haunted a generation, and the one most frequently remembered, was the boy who slips and drowns in a pool of pig feces, a slurry pit. The film's power came from its dreamlike or Grimm's fairy tale structure. It showed that the traditional farm was no longer a pastoral playground. It was a newly mechanized factory, a place where unsupervised play was now lethal. The film's most chilling and memorable motif was the banal domestic ritual that followed each gruesome death. After each accident, the film cuts back to the school, where a name tag is taken off a school cloakroom coat hook, and clothes are removed from a pretty bedroom drawer. This juxtaposition of quiet, everyday routine with violent, accidental death was the core of its psychological horror. The invisible threat: play safe. If Apaches show the dangers of new mechanized landscapes, the Play Safe series from 1978 addressed a threat that was completely invisible: the national electrical grid. Sponsored by the Electricity Council, these short films, often broadcast as 3 separate PIFs, warned children about overhead power lines and electrical substations. These films gained notoriety for their graphic, unflinching depictions of children being completely fried or frazzled by electrocution. The scenarios were drawn from real life, such as a boy climbing a pylon to get a better view, or children attempting to retrieve a frisbee or football from inside a substation. The danger was non-intuitive. The rural landscape, once safe, was now a wasteland of invisible high-voltage danger. This fear was grounded in statistical fact, not just in rural areas, but inside the home. The modernization of the British home was creating a new, invisible fire hazard. Domestic fires caused by electrical sources more than doubled in a single decade, soaring from 17,000 in 1970 to 35,000 in 1980. This was driven by a massive growth in electrical consumption. The average number of household appliances rose from 21 in 1970. This new electrical load was often placed on less reliable and outdated pre-1970s wiring, creating a high risk of short circuits and fires. The Play Safe series was part of a wider topography of fear that included many other mundane domestic perils. The 1971 film Children and Disused Fridges addressed a specific and now forgotten technological danger. Older refrigerators were built with latching doors that could not be opened from the inside, rather than the modern magnetic seals. The film, a horror cartoon, showed children becoming trapped inside and suffocating. Other films completed this landscape of domestic dread. Searching, 1974, was a haunting fire prevention film, and The Sewing Machine, 1971, used a child's eye view to depict the horror of being run over by a car. The shock tactic doctrine. The terror inflicted by these films was not a directorial accident. It was a calculated institutional policy. The Central Office of Information, or COI, was the UK government's primary producer and commissioner for PIFs. Operating from 1946 until its closure in 2011, the COI commissioned these shorts from independent production companies and worked with charities like RoSPA, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents. The distribution model was key to their cultural impact. PIFs were designed as fillers, short films, sometimes only a minute long, shown during television advertising breaks. Crucially, they were broadcast in school and heavily rotated during children's programming blocks, especially on holidays and weekends. This placement, often without warning, set the stage for their traumatic reception. During its 1970s golden age, the COI seemed convinced that the best way to get its various messages across was to instill rigid terror in its viewers. This was a brutal approach that strategically deployed death and mutilation to capture public attention. The explicit goal of this doctrine was to shock people out of their complacency. This shift was a direct response to a perceived rise in accidental child deaths and a belief that traditional didactic messaging was failing. This government strategy did not emerge from a vacuum. It was an adoption of a new fashionable trend in commercial advertising. The shock value of Saatchi and Saatchi's 1970 Pregnant Man campaign, commissioned for health education, along with graphic anti-smoking adverts, demonstrated that provocative, unsettling imagery was a powerful new tool. The COI, in its 1970s safety films, effectively weaponized this commercial tactic for state purposes. However, a deeper analysis reveals the COI did not rely solely on terror. It deployed a sophisticated and contradictory dual-track strategy, targeting different dangers with different psychological approaches. First was the gentle track. This was reserved for domestic or social dangers that required instruction and positive reinforcement. This category is defined by the Charley Says animated series, 1973, which addressed hazards like matches and talking to strangers. These campaigns used light-hearted animation and reassuring celebrity-driven heroes. The most prominent example was the Green Cross Code Man, 1976, portrayed by Dave Prowse, the actor who physically played Darth Vader, as a benevolent superhero teaching a 6-step process for crossing the road. Second was the horror track. This was reserved for dangers perceived as industrial, elemental, or non-negotiable. Films in this canon did not offer a hero or a set of instructions. They presented an implacable, non-human threat. Lonely Water, 1973, personified drowning as a spectral grim reaper. Apaches, 1977, presented the mechanized farm as a relentless killing field. Play Safe, 1978, depicted the electrical grid as an invisible executioner. The fact that the gentle Charley Says and the brutal terror of Lonely Water were created in the exact same year demonstrates this deliberate bifurcated approach. The gentle films were for dangers children could control, like matches or looking both ways, while the brutal terror films were for elemental forces where a single mistake was fatal. Deep water, farm machinery, high voltage. The folk horror aesthetic. The most potent example of this horror track doctrine was the 1973 film Lonely Water. This terrifying 2-minute short was aimed squarely at the 7 to 12 age group. It warned children against playing near rivers, ponds, and quarries. The danger highlighted was not just drowning, but the hidden and deceptive nature of the threat. The narrator describes the slippery banks, the weak, rotten branches overhanging the water, and the traps lurking beneath the surface. Old cars, bedsteads, weeds, hidden depths. The film is defined by its antagonist, the eerie, faceless, black-robed and cowled figure of the spirit. This personification of death itself, lurking in an ordinary pond, made the film play like a distilled horror film. This aesthetic was a masterclass of terror, primarily because of its doom-laden narration from horror legend Donald Pleasance. His final echoing line, "I'll be back, back, back," is the single element most frequently cited as having terrified an entire generation. This connection to horror cinema wasn't an accident. Lonely Water was released in the same year as Don't Look Now and The Wicker Man. BFI curators note the PIF is eerily redolent of Nicholas Roeg's film. The COI's horror PIFs were absorbing and reflecting the aesthetics of the 1970s British art house and folk horror cinematic boom. They deployed the menacing tone and special effects, normally the preserve of X-rated cinema shockers. The low-budget, gritty aesthetic of the films was one of their greatest assets. Directors have praised them for their bare simplicity and long silences. This lack of polish made them look real and eerily adult, distinguishing them from the light-hearted animated commercials of the same era. Their low-budget 16mm film quality and static crackle gave them a Hammer horror-style aura. This aesthetic was crafted by a small group of veteran documentary makers. John Krish, nicknamed Dr. Death, directed The Sewing Machine and the fire prevention film Searching. Krish rejected the idea that he was scaring his audience. His stated goal was not scaring but shaking, to create images that people couldn't forget. Jeff Grant, the director of Lonely Water, noted that the script he received from writer Christine Herman plumbed the darkness and set out to scare, a stark departure from previous, gentler safety films. These directors created unforgettable motifs. In The Sewing Machine, Krish created almost unbearable tension by employing an on-screen countdown of 60 seconds. As the mother is distracted, the audience knows it is counting down the final minute of her daughter's life. In Searching, Krish used the first-person perspective of a fire investigator prowling through a burned-out shell of a set, where he begins to hear the ghostly echoes of the victims. Many assume the spirit of Dark and Lonely Water is based on an ancient British folk tale, like a Kelpie or Grindylow. This is incorrect. The spirit was a modern invention, created specifically for the 1973 film by Christine Herman. It was a deliberate creative choice to evoke folkloric terror. The PIF became a form of modern-day folklore. It did not originate from it. The legacy of a haunted generation. These films were seared into the national memory. Viewers who grew up in the 1970s, now in their 50s and 60s, report being still terrified of the imagery. Lonely Water was even included in Channel 4's 100 Greatest Scary Moments. BFY Senior Curator Patrick Russell speaks for this haunted generation when he recalls the screening of Apaches in his primary school as an extraordinarily traumatic experience and a memory drenched in blood. This shared cultural trauma is central to the cult following these films have since developed. But did this state-sponsored trauma actually work? The anecdotal evidence is overwhelming. Adults today still report the films were actually effective on my child brain, instilling a lifelong, strong wariness of electricity pylons, train tracks, and dark, lonely water. By this measure, John Crish's goal to shake people and make the dangers unforgettable was a profound success. Modern academic analysis of these fear appeals is deeply skeptical. Research suggests that shock tactics are often ineffective or counterproductive. They run the risk of causing maladaptive responses, such as chronic heightened anxiety among the target audience, or, paradoxically, complacency. This leads to the final, unresolved ethical question. Was it justified? One position argues for the greater good. The films were a pragmatic, if brutal, response to a genuine crisis. As one modern director of shock tactic PIFs stated, "You're manipulating an audience to save a life. The old tricks are best." The other position argues it was unethical, state-sponsored trauma. The films are remembered as traumatizing, and they were not banned. A rare exception, The Finishing Line, 1977, a bloodbath set on a railway, was eventually withdrawn after being called tantamount to some kind of psychological abuse. But Apaches and Lonely Water were broadcast repeatedly. The unresolved question is whether that terror was a pragmatic price to pay for safety, or a form of psychological abuse inflicted by a state that was simultaneously a nurturing parent and a terrifying monster. So, did you watch any of these adverts? Let me know in the comments below. And for more journeys into Britain's past, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.